Welcome to the Life in Norway Show. On today's episode, we mark the sensational season of the Norwegian football club BodGlimt, who were just confirmed as the winners of the Norwegian League this weekend. I speak to their head of the academy, Gregg Broughton, who is from the UK but chose to move to this small Norwegian town many miles north of the Arctic Circle. We talk about why he chose to swap English football for the Arctic, what the keys to Glimt's remarkable season have been, and a little bit about life in Bodø and northern Norway. You can find out more information about today's show, including links to everything we talk about, on the show notes page. Just head on over to lifeinnorway.net/podcast and look for episode 48. Happy listening. I'm joined today by Gregg Broughton from BodGlimt, where he is the Academy Director. Gregg, welcome to the show.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for having me on.
First things first, congratulations on winning the title.
Thank you. It's been a strange season with everything considered, but a magnificent achievement by everybody involved, and just so happy for the supporters and the people of the city and of the region.
We'll dive into details shortly, but first of all, what brought you to Norway? We don't find that many Englishmen in Norwegian football. It's normally the other way around. So what's an Englishman doing in the Arctic Circle working for a football team?
Yeah, well, I've been working in the English game for 18 years, full-time, Rushden and Diamonds, then to my hometown club, Luton, and then finally at Norwich City. And during that time, I was very lucky to travel through a lot of Scandinavia, through both going to tournaments and also scouting. And my family and I really wanted to experience life in Scandinavia. We didn't really know where. And I'd had conversations with 2 or 3 clubs, and the project that they were trying to do wasn't really what I was looking for at that stage. And then one of the agents that I was working with, a Scandinavian agent, mentioned to me about BodGlimt and that they were looking for an academy director. So we had a conversation. I have to be honest with you, I wasn't sure where Bodø was. Even though I'd been to a lot of different areas in Norway, I'd even been further north than Bodø before, but I didn't know where it was. So we had a look, and my wife and I discussed it, and she looked at the map and said, wow, that's quite far north. So after conversations with the club initially on the phone, I was really sure of the project and what they were trying to do. But it then came about that life decision about whether you can relocate a family. So we kind of wrote down 5 questions, and we said, absolutely, the answer to these questions have to be yes. Otherwise, we're not going to do it. So we were lucky. In September 2017, we came and visited the city. And by the time we left, my wife was more convinced than I was that it was the right thing to do, because the answer to all 5 questions was definitely yes. So that's how it kind of came about.
So BodGlimt winning the title in Norway, this is a real story, and it's a story that's captured the attention of media around the world. There was just this last week an article in the New York Times covering this tiny Norwegian football club. So can you put into context this achievement? I've seen a lot of people compare it to Leicester City winning the Premier League in England a few years ago. Is it on that level? Where do you see it?
Yeah, I do think it's on that level. I'm being a little bit biased. I actually think it's a bit beyond that level, because Leicester had a very good wage structure within their club. Yes, it wasn't Manchester City or Liverpool's wage structure, I understand that, but it was a competitive wage structure for the top half of the Premier League. But BodGlimt don't have that wage structure or comparative wage structure. And football, ultimately, in any league in anywhere in the world, it's usually the clubs that pay the most money that have the most success. There's a direct correlation between the two in any country. So I think the sporting achievement is absolutely massive. And when you then dig back into the history of it, and the kind of the prejudice against people from the north until the 1960s, certainly from a football point of view, where they weren't allowed to compete in the National League till the 70s, BodGlimt being one of the first couple of clubs into that National League, and then winning the cup in 75. It just means so much for everybody. And it's just the supporters who can't get to the games that I'm desperately sorry for. But when you drive through the city on a Sunday afternoon and the yellow flags are flying on virtually every house, it gives you a real sense of pride and a sense that there's a real passion now in the city for it.
Your job title is Academy Director, but I imagine at such a small club, everyone pitches in on various things. So what are you responsible for at the club?
Well, my direct task is to try and create and maintain the best development environment in Norway. That's what we try and do within the academy. But directly, I've got responsibility for 5 areas, which is obviously the coaching of young players, the talent identification and recruitment of young players, education and welfare, because we have a school within Asmera where our young players attend every day, the physical and sports science point of view, and finally the analysis of games and individual analysis. But the bigger piece of work that hopefully I've been able to influence a little since I've been here at the club is the succession planning and ensuring that we try and plan more than one transfer window ahead, and that we have clear pathways so that if there's a debate about how we can get Håkan Evjen into the team or Jens Petter into the team, I have a voice. I don't have the final decision because ultimately at any club, the coach has to pick the team, and correctly so. But that technical heart and that meeting of minds and that discussion point is in a very healthy place. And Ørjan Berg has done a magnificent job of driving that communication throughout his time here at the club.
So what's a typical day like for you? I imagine this kind of work is not 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, as is more typical in Norway.
Yeah, no, there isn't a typical day. Quite often, especially during the regular football season, it can become 7 days a week. You have to be quite disciplined to make sure you block a day off. Otherwise, it disappears quite easily. But when your job is your vocation and your passion, you don't mind that. And you wouldn't work in football if you weren't desperately passionate about it, because you have to sacrifice antisocial hours, you have to sacrifice weekends, you have to travel. And you wouldn't do that if you didn't have a real desire to be working in the game.
Let's talk a little about football in Norway then, and how it differs, because you, having worked professionally in England and now professionally in Norway, I imagine you've seen a lot of differences. I mean, the top league in Norway is professional, but then you take one step down from that and things change very quickly. So what have you seen are the biggest differences from English football over here in Norway?
Well, firstly, the standard of the teams at the top end of the Eliteserien is of a high level. And if you look at European competition in the last few years, it's not unusual for those teams to get into the group stages of the Europa League, although we haven't had Champions League success or qualification in Norway for a few years. That Europa League progress has been quite consistent. And so if you look at the Premier League, for example, the teams that finish 5th or 6th in the Premier League and qualify for the Europa League quite regularly don't get into those group stages. So I think the Eliteserien is probably a comparable level to the Scottish Premier League, maybe minus the fact that there's one intense rivalry at the top of the Scottish Premier League. But yeah, I think the standard at the top end of the Eliteserien is good. And yes, there is a gulf between the top and the bottom, not always between the size of the clubs, because look at BodGlimt as a small club overachieving this season. But certainly there is a gulf between the top and the bottom of that league. And there's certainly a huge gulf between the top and the bottom of the Obos-ligaen.
And how about the differences working within the system? Is there more pressure in England? Do you feel a bit freer in Norway to experiment and try new things?
Yeah, I think the great thing about working with young players in any country is you have that. There isn't that freedom. There isn't that pressure on results. So you have the freedom to experiment and be creative anyway. So I don't really notice that difference. I think the biggest differences directly in my job is, firstly, players don't come into the system here in Norway until they're 13 years old, or towards the end of their 12th year, they're selected. Whereas in the UK, that selection process is starting at 7 or 8. So the Norway model is definitely correct for Norway. And with my own personal biases, in terms of if you're thinking about the mental health of young people, it's probably the correct program. And if you look at AIK in Stockholm driving that project now for late selection in Scandinavia, Bayern Munich have come forward and done the same now and said we're not going to select 9 and 10-year-olds into the academy. But the UK system works for the UK. So that's not a criticism of their system. But the late selection of players makes a huge difference. Secondly, our second team play in the 3rd division here. So they're playing senior football, which again is very different to the UK, where the under-23 league is that buffer between the top and the bottom. Again, with the number of players in the UK, that's the correct system for their program. But here in Norway, we want to expose our young players to senior football as early as we can do. We have to try and get them around that if they're going to break into our first team as quickly as possible. And then I think the last thing is the distances. Even with our G14, our under 14 team, every away game is a flight. I think if I think about the mentality of players, probably the biggest difference is in the UK. Most young players are prepared to sacrifice absolutely anything to get to the top level. So their parents don't think anything of driving an hour and a half, 4 times a week to get to training. Players will put that at the very, very top ahead of everything. Whereas I think here in Norway, players have the middle class bracket is a lot wider here in Norway, as you well know. So players are a lot more comfortable. So I'm not sure that inner motivation is there for all of them. It is for some of them, without a doubt. If you look at some of the young players who've had success here at Glimt and at other clubs, they wouldn't do that without that inner motivation. But I think we constantly have to challenge that with our players and our parents to say, are you prepared to sacrifice what's needed to become an elite athlete? Because the market you're trying to get into isn't a North Norwegian market or even a Norwegian market. We've got Nigerians, we've got Israeli Russians, we've got Danes playing for our first team. What are you prepared to sacrifice to compete with those guys?
In terms of a business model for a club like Bodø, a very small club and in recent times, you've brought through some very young players who've gone into the first team very young, and then, as with many Norwegian teams, have been sold into teams in the Netherlands or Belgium and places like that. Is that a realistic business model here in Norway? The process of bringing through young players and selling them on for a profit sustains the club.
Yeah, well, there's different levels of club in Norway, as you know. So with Rosenborg or Molde, I'm sure they have a different financial model. But for a club the size of Glimt, and one of the reasons that attracted me to come and work here is they have an absolute commitment to put young players in the team. We have some very clear KPIs. We want 40% of the team to be of North Norwegian background, and the target's 15% of players under the age of 23 to have come through the academy. That's in terms of league minutes played. At the moment, we're at 25%, which is why there was almost a slip of a tongue there. But those clear metrics and those clear KPIs underpin what the club is trying to do. They have a very clear strategic aim. And that strategy, I don't think, can be separated from the current success the team is having. In fact, if you talk to Ørjan Berg or Stig Johansson or Jan Erik Bjørk and some of the guys who've been here for many, many years, when you look at the cyclical history of football, especially here at BodGlimt, every time the team is at the top end of the table, there is a backbone of North Norwegian talent running throughout it. So we have to ensure that we have the supply chain of young players coming through so that the coaching staff within the first team can always have players to select from.
Well, one of the stories of this season was you came within a whisker of winning away in the San Siro against AC Milan. And then a couple of weeks later, Jens Petter Hauge, who absolutely starred in that game and has starred throughout this season, of course, joined AC Milan for what I can only assume is a record transfer fee for BodGlimt. Can you tell us a bit about his story? Because to go from a very small club in Northern Norway to one of the biggest names in European football is, in the blink of an eye for most people, is sensational. So tell us a bit about his progress over the years.
So I came into the club and Jens Petter was already an established first team player. So I didn't see the first part of his journey firsthand, but I did see it secondhand. When I was working as head of player recruitment at Norwich, he was somebody who sat on our database. We were aware that there was interest from Southampton and other clubs for him. So he wasn't somebody who suddenly had come under the radar. And obviously in 2017, he'd had a very good season in the Obos League, and when Glimt won the league, and he'd done very well in that team. But I think in 2018, he fell out of favour a little bit. He didn't fit into how Kjetil saw the team playing. And he had to go out and experience a loan, which wasn't a successful loan on paper. But in my experience, there is no such thing as a bad loan experience as long as you're prepared to learn from it. And Jens Petter did learn from that. When he came in at the beginning of 2019, he was very, very focused because the under-20 Norwegian team was preparing to qualify for the under-20 World Cup, and he was part of that squad. So I think that had given him some more focus, and the first team training staff had seen that. but he still wasn't a player that was getting selected in the first 11. He was coming on off the bench, but he wasn't selected. And in the summer, we had a discussion in the technical heart about Amor Lioni. There was a bid for Amor from Egypt. And should we sell? Should we not sell? We were fighting for a silver medal. And I think the point we made as an academy was that if we are able to get cash in for Amor at that stage, we've got 10 games left in the season. It's a great chance to throw Jens Petter in and see where he's at. What can he do? And he did okay. He didn't set the world on fire. He did okay at the back end of 2019. And even at the beginning of 2020, there was questions about whether that absolute style of football that Kjetil won't deviate from, correctly so, because of the success it's given us, whether Jens Petter was that man to fit into that system. So again, when he was discussed, we accepted a bid from Cercle Bruges, and he was gone. If it wasn't for the pandemic, he would have gone. So I think he then played himself into contention. The message began to sink home. A light switch maybe went on, and he thought, okay, I need to do this. I need to be prepared to work this hard and commit this in order to have the success within the team unit that is number one with everything at Glimt. And then it just went from there. And luckily, because the Bruges thing hadn't happened, he then began to attract interest from all over Europe. Literally all over Europe. And despite the travel restrictions, we were having scouts coming into the games here at Asmera, watching him from some of the biggest leagues in Europe. And then really it was his performances, although I'm sure he was on the radar at Milan ahead of that game. Once he'd played like that in the San Siro, they weren't prepared to let their man go, and correctly so.
Yeah. And of course, he's whilst not a first team starter at Milan, he's come off the substitutes bench many times and has scored. So I think it's certainly not beyond his level. You anticipate him fitting in nicely there?
It's very difficult to say whether he'll fit in, because ultimately the coach so often changes in a football club. So if the first team coach buys into him, I've got no doubt he can fit into that level without no doubt whatsoever. And again, if you compare that kind of generation of players, that young generation of Norwegian players now playing in the top leagues in Europe, Jens Petter has deservedly now put himself on the same map as some of those other top players at top clubs in Europe.
You've touched on this already, Greg, but one of the ironies, the awful things about this season is that you've absolutely set Norwegian football on fire. They are free-flowing, scoring bagfuls of goals against some very good teams. They have been incredibly exciting to watch as a neutral, and even for me as a fan of a team that's also battling to finish in the top three this season. They have been great to watch. And yet, very few people in Bodø have had the opportunity to watch this team in person because of the pandemic restrictions. We've had a maximum of 200 people being in the stadiums for most of the season. What's it been like in the everyday? How has the pandemic restricted the work that you do? And what's it been like on those match days?
From a day-to-day effect, we are lucky. We have been isolated here from an infection point of view in Bodø, and it's not as bad as it could be in other places in Norway and certainly in other places in Europe. So I feel very blessed that we've been able to spend this time here during the pandemic. But I think if I could go back one step before I answer the question directly, in terms of the style of play, when the club have a very clear mission statement, we want to make North Norwegianers proud. When I came in, I asked, well, what does make North Norwegianers proud? So we did a piece of work where we kind of met with all of the key groups, the supporters groups, the coffee table of the old legends who sit and have coffee every day at Asmera, the administration, the players, the parents, and we asked them what makes North Norwegianers proud. And we came up with three things. There were three constant messages that came out in those conversations. Number one, hard work. Well, every football club says we want to work hard. That's a throwaway statement, but what does that really, really mean? And if you want to work hard and go and regain the ball high up the pitch and press the ball, you have to really, really buy into that, because that's not easy to do. But it's what we try and do with all of our players here at Glimt. And I think the second thing is bravery. You talk about what it needed to survive in the north of Norway in generations past. But we are a brave football club. We try and play an open style of football. We'd rather win a game 5-4 than 1-0. In fact, I made that statement at a sponsors meeting last season, and I was there with Ricardo, the Brazilian goalkeeper who's no longer with us. And then that was on a Friday. And then on the Sunday, we played Mjøndalen away and won 5-4 with Håkon Evjen scoring in the last minute. And Ricardo texted me after the game. He said, "Is that what you were asking for?" So, that bravery and style of play. And finally, it's about being in the moment. We know that the white gold, as it's called here in the north of Norway, cod skrei, there was a very, very limited window to either keep your family alive for the year and have success, or possibly perish because the sea can be so rough in February and March. So that ability to seize the moment and live in the moment has been something really big. And Bjørn Mansvak, as the psychologist working with the first team, is all about being in the moment and being present in every training session and every match and trying to control the controllables. So those three things, we talk about what gave Leicester success, but that has driven us throughout this year. But in terms of the actual impact upon the club, I think with the first team, in terms of the training and matches, it's had limited impact in terms of how we've been able to prepare. But I think there's been key moments in the season. For example, away at Rosenborg, very early in the season, we've gone from controlling the game and being 1-0 up to 2-1 down with 10 minutes to go. And a full stadium at Rosenborg might have swayed that game. Might, I underline the word might, have swayed that game. And all of a sudden, we've been able to come back and win the game 3-2. And at 2-2, there's only one team that's going to go on and win that game. And a full stadium may have affected little things like that. I don't know. Playing at Milan away, how would that game have been with, I don't know if it would have been 80,000 fans in there, but certainly 50,000 fans in there. I don't know. So has a low capacity of crowd helped us to achieve that? That's only speculation. Nobody will ever know that. But obviously, with our young players being able to not play in the national leagues this year, correctly so, because we don't want to send young players all over the country every weekend. But that's had a real impact, especially on those boys born in 2002, those closest. We've seen their inner motivation and their drive really drop throughout the year because there's been nothing really to aim for. So that's been a tough year for those guys. But the ones it's been toughest for has been our spectators. As you've said already, only 200 fans. We're now just about up to 600 fans. But Aspmyra would have been a full stadium every single week. And to deny the fans that opportunity to come in and watch it, it must be heartbreaking for them, although I'm sure they're not minding too much because we've won the league.
Now, on that note, Greg, how does such a small club with limited resources, a relatively very small stadium, how do you turn this season's success into something that's sustainable?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to look at the factors that underpin success. And if it's because we've been unbelievably lucky in the transfer market, or if it's because our playing budget is bigger this year for a given reason, then there should be worries as to whether that success is sustainable. But I think the success at BodGlimt and Frode Thomassen and the board deserve great credit for this. Is built on a very, very clear vision, a very, very clear strategy. The vision is focused on performance. It's not focused on results. If you listen to Kjetil talk before or after games, he never talks about the result. He always talks about the level of performance. And that's something we try and buy into throughout the whole club. Because we can control performance, we can't control the result because there's so many external factors in football. The opposition team is set up every single game to try and stop you achieving. So we control what we can try and control. But I think by keeping that Norwegian identity clear throughout the team, throughout the club, it's one of the big things that underpins our success. But we also have to be prepared that are we going to be top of the league every year for the next 5 years? I don't think it takes a brave man to say probably not. But can we plan to have success on a regular basis, maybe every third to fifth year? Possibly. Does that mean we'll win the league every third to fifth year? That's no guarantee, because ultimately, however well you do as a club, if Rosenborg or Molde or any of the other clubs whose budget is far higher than yours is performing on all cylinders, then possibly you won't finish ahead of them. That's just the nature of the beast. But I think the key thing to it is Diego Simeone, when he talks about Athletic Madrid, talks about their very clear identity and style of play. He says we can't try and be anybody else because they're already them. They're better at that identity than we will ever be. So we have to be ourselves, and keeping our identity and keeping our strategy and vision here at the club, I really believe will give us long-term success.
I have to say, Greg, that's a refreshingly honest answer, and it's not something you tend to hear from other football clubs. So it just goes to show that you do have a plan in place and realistic expectations, shall we say. So if I can put words in your mouth, what I'm hearing from you is that you already had a plan a long time ago for what would happen after the sale of Jens Petter Hauge, which was somewhat inevitable. You already knew what the next steps would be. It wasn't a case of, okay, he's joined Milan, what do we do now?
No, definitely. And look, there are other young players having fantastic seasons, and it's going to be very, very hard in the next window for the club to keep Fredrik, to keep Patrick and some of the young players having success right now. So if Patrick Berg leaves the club, what is going to happen? Well, one of the reasons we've sent Usk, who is a player born in 2001, on loan to Blink in the Oberliga now is to say, how quickly can we get you ready to step into those shoes of Patrick? That might be by the end of 2021. But again, we're trying to think 3 transfer windows ahead. But ultimately, until you put a young player in the team, you never know. You never know where they're going to get you to. If I think back to my experience at Norwich, if you'd said that a team with Jamal Lewis, Max Aarons, Todd Cantwell, Ben Godfrey, even Adam Eder coming off the bench would get your team promoted to the Premier League and make you competitive, but ultimately not quite enough to survive in the Premier League. 3 years ago, people would have laughed at you, and Stuart Webber's been able to drive that throughout, that identity throughout the club at Norwich, and put a really, really good plan in place to bring young players in. And we have to continue to do that here at BodGlimt.
Excellent. Now, we've probably lost a lot of people who aren't interested in football a long time ago, but I want to talk about some non-football things now.
Yeah.
You mentioned that your wife in particular was really keen to move to Bodø after you visited and looked around the city. So, and from everything you've been saying about North Norwegian identity, it sounds like you're very... you've settled in very nicely to that part of the world. But going back to when you first moved, what were your first impressions of life in the Arctic?
Well, firstly, the day we visited here in Bodø, the sky was blue and there was no wind.
Oh, dear.
And Jonas Kulstad was one of the first people I met when I walked into Aspen. And he said, yeah, it's like this all year round at Bodø. You've got nothing to be concerned about. So we got lucky with the timing. But I think our first impressions was we really liked the city, and we loved the compactness of the city, the fact that you didn't have to commute, the fact that you weren't stuck in traffic every single day. We stayed in the Scandic Harvit on a high floor with an unbelievable vista looking out to Lofoten and across to Steigen and down to Sandenoy to the south, and this amazing view. So you'll walk in, and when you live in Cambridgeshire, which doesn't have a hill, never mind a mountain, then you can't help but fall in love with the nature.
And what we're talking about here, of course, we should have said this at the top of the show. It's a town of, 50,000 people?
50,000, like, yeah.
50,000, yeah. This is not a large place. Now you've spent a couple years there. How have you and your family adapted?
It took a while because my wife is a surveyor, and that job doesn't translate directly to Norway. So I think the biggest hurdle initially was for her to find work in her chosen field. And we said that if that hadn't happened within a year, then we wouldn't stay here, because it's not fair of me to ask her to sacrifice her career just so I can indulge in playing football across the world or traveling football across the world. So she was lucky. She managed to get that role at Bollebyggelag within the city within a year. And that's really helped her, and her language has flown because of that. Her Norwegians are far, far higher level than mine, as she constantly laughs at my 3-year-old laughs at my stuttered attempts to speak. So my written and my reading of Norwegian is okay, probably A2 standard, but my spoken Norwegian, spoken English isn't great at the moment, but my spoken Norwegian isn't at a great level. And it's an easy cliche throwaway because Norwegians are so good at speaking English. But it's mainly because of my bravery to try it and get out there and use it a little bit more often.
On that note, we're going to just take the conversation back to football for a moment.
Yeah.
The football is such an international environment these days. Even in the average Norwegian team, there are players from all over the world.
Yeah.
Does that mean the working language is English in most clubs, or is there a big mix? How does it work on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's a mix. When our first team train, quite often Kjetil is speaking in Norwegian, and Morten might be speaking, or Osman might be speaking in English, because there are non-Norwegian speakers within the group. The language in the locker rooms tends to move between the both. In the academy room, because I'm not the only Englishman at the club, there is an emphasis on English, but all of our working and strategic documents are in Norwegian, and correctly so, because this is a Norwegian football club. When I attend board meetings, I tend to try and listen in Norwegian and respond in English if I can do, with maybe a few questions thrown in to help me along the way. But I think football is an international industry, and English underpins that in most clubs. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't embrace Norwegian at all opportunities, especially when you're trying to communicate with young players.
Back to Bodø, what are your favourite things to do in the area? How do you spend your time, the limited time that you have when you're not working with the football club?
Well, embracing Gopator and going out and embracing nature has become a really big thing. My wife had a revelation within moving here that the reason you're so cold all the time in the UK in winter is because you don't dress appropriately, and nobody tells you that. So I think the moment you've got the correct kind of clothes, it's actually brilliant to be outside. Even if you try and, as they say here in Bodø, go and meet the wind, go and face the wind. So I think going outside as much as possible and embracing the fantastic nature that we have right here on our doorstep, where we have beaches and mountains and forests and everything you could want within a 10-minute drive of the city, has just been fantastic for us as a family.
That's good to hear, because I hear what you're saying about embracing the outdoors, because Bodø, I think, is without a doubt the windiest place I've ever been in Norway, and I've seen most of the country by now in my 10 years or so. The final questions I ask every guest here on the Life in Norway show, so some quick answers from you, please. What's the best thing about life in Norway? Well,
for me and for our own personal situation, it's the standard of barnehages and childcare. Our son is 3 years old, our oldest son is 3 years old now, and he goes to an outdoor barnehage here. And it's just the standard of care that he gets every single day. He runs into barnehage, he has to be dragged out of barnehage, and he just absolutely loves it there, which as a parent is all you can ever wish for.
And how about the most challenging thing about life in Bodø, and Norway in general?
Yeah, I think the most challenging thing living in Bodø specifically is the fact that there's no direct flights to most of Europe. So it's a long journey to get anywhere. But I think if you try and look at Norway as a whole, I think the biggest challenge for someone who speaks English as their first language is the fact that you have to be really dedicated to learn Norwegian, because Norwegians are so good at speaking English and so willing to speak English with you that you have to be brave and you have to make sacrifices in order to break that barrier down.
And your favourite place in Norway?
There's so many to choose from, but I think for me it would be Steigen. I love Lofoten, I love the whole of Nordland and Hålogaland, but Steigen is just a very small, it's almost a hidden gem. And I was reluctant, I almost didn't mention it when I knew you might ask me this question, because it's one of those places that is just, I can't believe it's not a central tourist destination for Europe, because it's just so amazing there.
Gregg, this has been wonderful learning about your role and getting some insight into Glimt's sensational season. Thank you very much for being so honest and forthcoming with your answers. Where can people find out more about the club and the work of the academy?
Well, glimt.no has all of the details about the club, and the academy has its own various links from that website as well. But the club does a great job in terms of giving out the latest news on its website, so that's the best place to follow the club.
Yeah, and of course most of the website's in Norwegian, but you could also search out the recent article in the New York Times amongst other publications about Bodø if you want to get a flavour for the season that they have just enjoyed. I'll also include links to all these things in the show notes, which you can find at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. Gregg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, David. It's been really enjoyable.